Cool. So welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. Beautiful evening we have finally, right? My name's Elliot Proud. I'm the president of the Serenoa chapter, and really glad to see everybody out here tonight. If we need more chairs, we might. Maybe Bruce, is there more chairs somewhere that we could? I don't know if we do or not, but maybe. Okay, we'll just get snug. There's more chairs up here. Okay, cool. It just goes to show how popular our speaker is tonight. But anyways, appreciate everybody coming out. We're pretty early in the season, but I'm really excited about our schedule of field trips that we have going on, and all the speakers that we have planned, and we're still booking people for next year. So it should be really cool to see what we have going on. Our last field trip was at Mayaca River State Park, where we went and saw wildflowers, and that was a great field trip as well. We're doing pretty well with our board positions too. This is the first night that I'm coming to you and not asking somebody to be on our board. So you're welcome. And thanks to Kyle Fowler, who took over our membership position. And he's only been a member for what, a year and a half or so? Yeah, okay. So it's possible, even if you're a new member, you can come in and help out. But that being said, I don't have too much news to announce. I'll announce our next trips after the meeting. But tonight we're really lucky to have John McCarthy. John McCarthy, yeah. He's the Vice President of Regional History at Marie Selby Botanical Gardens. And as I understand it, very passionate about bringing nature and heritage together and educating people to build a sense of community. He's also a native Floridian. So really lucky to have him. He's got a great presentation, great speaker. So thank you so much, John.
Well, thanks for everyone for coming out tonight. So let's see, let's get into the talk right now. Look at what's here. Look at once here. All right, so I was adopted with the historic Spanish Point campus 5 years ago. And at that time, Marie Selby Botanical Gardens developed this new mission statement to provide bayfront sanctuaries connecting people with air plants of the world, native nature, and our regional history. So tonight we're going to focus on that last item down there. Most people know Selby Gardens is a beautiful place to go on the bayfront, and a lot of people, I think, don't realize how we work all over the planet because we're in the conservation business, the discovery of wild native plants all over. We have a couple of our botanists here in the audience tonight that have exchanged plants and discovered plants and worked with botanical gardens all over the world. So we are a global entity. These are some of the places we go, primarily the tropics, because that's where the epiphytes are that we are specialists in. And we have published since the very beginning the Selbyana, our scientific journal, and then we participate and contribute to other scientific journals. And so we're just not a place of pretty flowers. We're doing all kinds of important science. And we've gotten noticed by a lot of big people in the world, people like Time Magazine, who last year thought we were one of the world's greatest places, and Vogue Magazine and Wall Street Journal. In fact, Wall Street Journal gave us an architectural award for our phase 1 project, and we were ranked above the restoration of Notre Dame. I think is fascinating. Coming up soon is phase 2. You might have seen we've got construction fencing up. We've going to be replacing the original glass houses with a new glass house structure. This is kind of a layout of what that's going to look like, several different plant climates. And I just included these slides because most people have not seen them. These are inside shots of what that new facility is going to look like. And you're going to go from seeing about 5 to 10% of our collection to seeing 90 to 95% of our collection. There's going to be multiple levels. See the canopy walk in there, of course, to get people up into the trees, and a montane climate for the more highly elevated epiphytes, and a little jewel box area for our very small, very precious, very rare, very significant plants as well. So these renderings kind of give you an idea, like behind the scenes, place to grow and do research. And so, and also an education center for youth and adults looking out on the bayfront, connected to the new glass houses, intended to be net positive energy like the rest of the garden. And a couple of things we have going on right now. We've been talking about a lot tonight in the social time, lights at Spooky Point. If you want to see bat orchids and Dracula orchids and ghost orchids and monkey orchids and all those kind of orchids, go to lights at Spooky Point and check them out. They're all lit up until November 1st. And also getting ready to come to Spanish Point is a new art exhibit from Robert Louis Stevenson's A Child's Garden of Verses. We will have poetry and images propped up around the site in appropriate locations. So come and check that out after November. And right now, our orchid show just opened up here at the downtown campus. If you've not had a chance to walk into the Payne Mansion and be literally immersed in dried flowers, now's your chance. Do it before December 7th and come see the work of contemporary Scottish artist Rebecca Louise Law, who takes dried flowers from different communities and has volunteer participant in stringing them up on these copper strings. And the image that you see of her standing amongst her thing there on the right-hand side is nothing compared to what you will see in Payne Mansion. And then our next big exhibit downtown is going to be Alexander Calder, the man who developed the kinetic mobile. And Alexander Calder was inspired by the circus in terms of how he did his balancing of his mobiles. And so we're going to have a wonderful exhibit where we'll feature Calder in the Selby, in the Payne Mansion, in the conservatory, and in the grounds. So that's all coming up. One organization, two campuses. Archaeology of the Region is the program that we're going to talk about tonight. I steal images from everyone, so I'm giving credit to them here. Look fast. Great. Today's program is kind of divided up into 4 sections. It used to be 3, and I added the last one at the request of the last person I presented this for. And so let's talk about these people, right? So the people had to come from somewhere, and we all learned in school that they came across Bering Strait, from Asia and into North America, and then down south through Central and South America, and by 20,000 years ago, all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, which is kind of amazing. And so the one thing that's changed, and I should have put an arrow on this, it's now believed that a lot of this travel was actually by water, not so much just by land, but by water, simultaneous. So people were coming across the land as the ice ages were changing, but they were also navigators and coming down that way. So that could have helped them. And then this is an image that's kind of representative of the earliest people in Florida who were living here at the same time. You had mammoths, mastodon, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed tigers, and all kinds of cool things like that we find fossils of today. And these were hunters and gatherers. This is the Paleo period. This is when you're using stone tools to bring down large animals to get your protein, which you need to survive. And then you're gathering berries and other plant materials in the woods and making a go at it and adapting to a changing climate over generations. Not this fast climate change we're seeing now, but climate change over generations. And then this image is just, I think, so evocative of what it was like when people moved and realized that there was lots of available protein along the coastline. And so all you had to do was go out into the bays and gather up the fish or the crabs or the oysters or the clams or whatever kind of protein you wanted to eat from the sea. And this took place for thousands of years in Sarasota area. And so it's fascinating to me how these people were able to live here kind of sustainably, literally for thousands of years and not run out of food. And kind of amazing. And this is a great little scene because if you're familiar with Spanish Point, if you were like just offshore the Guptill House, that would be Spanish Point in the background on the left in the back, and then these little mangrove islands, and of course seagrasses all over the bottoms and all kinds of critters living out there. These people were great navigators and could travel quite a bit of a distance around Florida. Some people believe they had exchange with Yucatan and other places. Spanish Point is a place that's literally made from recycled food waste, right? So we ate clams and oysters and whelks and conchs for thousands of years, and originally it would have been just a trash pile where we're just dumping this stuff and kind of living around it. And then I think at some point these people realized, that's interesting, where we have these piles of shell, it didn't get wiped out by the last storm. Oh, that's interesting. If we make it even higher, we get a little better breeze. That's interesting. If we got a better breeze, we got fewer bugs and we got a better view. And now we can really weather the big storms. And so this image that has no vegetation in it kind of shows what the mounds would have looked like in the early days at Spanish Point or many of their sites that existed around the area that we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. And so it kind of evolved from trash piles into architecture, foundations for homes. And this is a great image because actually at Spanish Point over by the Guptill House, there's a ring mound just like this one. It was purposely constructed like a little amphitheater. And it was a place where people gathered in the summertime, and we know that because scientists can tell you when the scallop shells were killed and eaten based upon what those scallop shells look like now. And so the thought is that in the summertime, people migrated to the site, ate large, vast quantities of scallops and other things, and then departed. So we have, we'll talk more about that when we get to Spanish Point. These people were very industrious and also very creative. They developed pottery here in Florida. In fact, some of the oldest pottery in Florida was found at historic Spanish Point back in the early 1960s. It was tempered with sand and clay and little bits of Spanish moss and palmetto fiber into what is now called fiber tempered pottery. Then they evolved away from those plant inclusions and went to like a sand tempered, just sand and clay. That's the most common pottery type from the time period of Spanish Point. And then closer toward European contact, if you get into like 1,000 years ago to about 500 years ago, they started doing a lot of decoration. And I think this is representative of the fact that you don't have to hunt your mastodon anymore. You don't have to go out and hunt all those animals in the woods. You get all the protein you need out of the bay, gives you more time to be creative. And they were very creative. So these are some images that are done by an artist who allows his work to be used in educational programs, non-copyrighted. And he took these from actual examples of artifacts that have been found in Florida. So for instance, this mask that you're seeing this gentleman working on here in crafting is actually a real item. And back in the 1890s, an archaeologist named Frank Hamilton Cushing started exploring what we now call Marco Island. And at Marco were tremendous shell mounds, but he was working in the mangrove peat. And down in the mangrove peat, he found preserved wooden sculptures, and we were looking at them. So you've got a deer with the ears as separate pieces of wood glued in place. We've got osprey, and we've got an alligator. Very iconic Florida images, you know, to have. And these wooden items were preserved by the anaerobic nature of the. How big were they? So the deer is almost life size, the osprey is probably over life size, and the alligator is probably life size. And this one is the most famous of the items that he removed from the muck there at Marco. And this is called the Marco Island cat. It is owned by the Smithsonian Institute. It is on loan now to the Marco Island Museum. It is about 8 inches tall. It is made out of lignum vitae. And those of you that know native plants know that lignum vitae is also known as ironwood. It's one of the hardest woods. It has some oil in it. It was used for ship bearings in the early years and lawn bowls in England. If you want some lignum vitae, buy a lawn bowl on eBay and carve something out of it. So this is the Marco cat or the Marco panther. All right, so let's bring it home. This is an aerial image from Google Earth showing the outlines of Sarasota County, which is the territory that I am most familiar with. All of the yellow arrows are little archaeological sites of significance, and the two fuchsia arrows are the downtown Sarasota campus on Mound Street, very interesting, and the Spanish Point campus. So we'll talk about those a little bit more later. And the red arrow is a place where I did the program the last time, and I didn't take the red arrow off. So this is John McCarthy's version of 12,000 years of history. And if you go online and you start poking around this Florida history stuff, nowhere will you find everything in the same place. So if we start at the bottom of this, because we're going to get into detail here in the next couple minutes, 12,000 years ago. Okay, so we have documented human beings living in Sarasota County 12,000 years ago, and those explorations and discoveries were made at Little Salt Spring down in Northport. Moving up in time, 10,000 years ago, documented at War Mineral Springs in Northport. This new site that was discovered about 10 years ago, offshore of Manasota Key, submerged in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, is a cemetery that was used from 7,000 to 6,000 years ago. A cemetery that was used for 1,000 years that was in a freshwater marsh prior to current sea level rise. Inundated by water and sand, preserved, and then rediscovered when erosion revealed it. So that one kind of filled in a gap in the history. Then we get to 6,000 years ago, which is the Little Salt Spring Slough Cemetery, which reaches north from Little Salt Spring, up between the high school there in Northport and the law enforcement driving training range. And within that were found hundreds of burials that were down in the peat in the marsh there. And then we get to 5,000 years ago, we have the archaic shell ring at historic Spanish Point. That's where the boatyard is. That's where the Gupto house is on top of. Bertha Palmer's aqueduct rings around it. And so that is one of the oldest shell mounds on the west coast of Florida, and certainly one of the best preserved. And then if you were to go down to Inglewood to Indian Mountain Park, that's about 3,000 years old. I don't use like BC and AD because I don't think y'all should have to do any math. I just use BP before present. That's how old it is, okay? And then the shell bridge at Spanish Point, the point itself, the one that juts out into the bay in a straight line heading out toward the Gulf, that one's approximately 2,500 to 3,000 years ago. And then there's little shell mounds, shell middens all over Sarasota that range from 800 to maybe 1,500 years old. I mean, I was doing this very same program down at Minnesota Key one night, and this woman says, "What is the shell midden?" I said, "Well, that's where you got layers of shell and you got pottery in there." She goes, "I think I have one of those in my front yard." Went over to the front yard, when they cut her driveway, they exposed the midden, and I'm pulling out pottery and shell tools, and she's freaking out. And then just as a reference point, Ponce de Leon gets into Charlotte Harbor, about 500 years ago now, and off on the, okay, I don't mean to spend too much time. Don't anybody fall asleep to the slide, because I'm gonna move off it here soon. But so the Great Walls of Jericho, just for reference, 8,000 years old. That's one of the oldest, the world recognized. Great Pyramids of Giza, 4,500. Stonehenge, 5,000. So that's lining up with the archaic trail ring at Spanish Point. Great Wall of China started being built about 2,700 years ago. So that's lining up with the point at Spanish Point. And then over here on the right are the different periods of time that the archaeologists use. So they call these Paleo Indians in this early time. They're hunting with stone tools and they're killing big animals. And then you get into the early archaic, the middle archaic, the late archaic, what they call Minnesota culture, which is a series of traits that are exhibited by mounds that were present in Sarasota and Manatee County. And so the archaeologists said, we're going to call this Minnesota culture. And then when you get up toward the discovery of the New World by Europeans, you had a culture living here that they now call Safety Harbor culture, because it was in Safety Harbor, Florida, up in Old Tampa Bay, where they first discovered the type of artifacts that are representative of that particular culture, which involves a lot more decorative pottery and things like that. All right, let's go visit some of these places. So this is a property owned by University of Miami down in Northport. This is Little Salt Spring property here. I think it's about 68 acres. And from a native plants standpoint, this little slough that comes out of the spring has some very important native plants growing there. And Selby's been working with the archaeologists down on this property for a number of years to document and conserve. And then this is the actual spring itself. Just this wonderful little hourglass viewer into history. So this is an item that appeared in the National Geographic magazine showing basically the cross section of Little Salt. And it is surrounded by trees. You walk through the woods and you come out on this round mirror. They have a dot going out to the middle. It's about 200 feet down to the bottom. And there are ledges. And it's on these ledges where people lived back when sea level was lower, before the current end of the ice age. And so everything down here then got inundated, and this water has very little oxygen in it. So all this stuff is exceptionally well preserved, which is what makes these sites so important. So here's another view of that, just a little sketch view. And down here you have the names of people that have explored some of these underwater caverns, which to me is scary business. Scary business. You're down 250 feet. You're breathing like a nitrogen mix. You got nobody to come and get you. But check this out. So right about this level, you've got the Mastodon era. Okay. So that's like 20, 25, 30,000 years ago. And that's down about 85 feet. And then up here, you got what they call the Indian Ledge, down about 45 feet. And that's where the archaeological work has primarily taken place on these ledges. So again, this is owned by University of Miami. This is a piece of a deer antler. Can you see how this is a deer antler? It's got the little branch coming off here. It's just a little section, and it has been purposefully notched. It's approximately 9,000 years old. This is a greenstone pendant. Greenstone doesn't come from around here, so this is an import from elsewhere in the Americas. And this is approximately 7,000 years ago. This was found with 7,000-year-old dated items. So this is a pendant representing art 7,000 years ago. This is an artist rendering of what it would have looked like. The archaeologists found stakes driven into the side of the spring where they think that they had a rope ladder system where they could go up and down. Why would they go down in there? Because there was hardly any water in Florida back then. Florida was much more arid. We had different plants growing. You had a much more arid landscape, and so these springs were very precious to the animals. So the animals would kind of fall in there and get stuck, and then the people would go down there and get them. And this image shows people eating one of the giant land tortoises. So these days they pretty much only survive, in the Galapagos. But back then they were all over Florida and all over the world really, and mostly taken for their oil for the same reason that whales were killed and sea turtles were killed, because they're full of oil. And then here's another view of a kind of a different cross section, but this is a form of archaeology I will never engage in. I like to be above the surface of the water. So just 2 miles from Little Salt Spring is War Mineral Springs. Anybody ever been to War Mineral? It's like a spa. Yeah, it has the cyclorama celebrating Ponce de Leon's discovery of the Fountain of Youth. And people come here every day to retain their youth. And I went down there when I was just out of high school, and the old people said, "What are you doing here? You're so young." And I said, "No, I'm 100 years old. I've been coming here every day. I never saw so many lounge chairs before in my life. They were all gold anodized." Anyway, people bob around on the surface almost unaware of what's going on down below, similar to Little Salt Spring. You got these ledges up here. And this one was discovered before War Mineral Springs, and it was originally discovered by a retired Air Force colonel who was an amateur diver at a time when scuba diving was brand new, back in the 1950s. Things like scuba diving haven't been around forever, but when it was new back in the 1950s, and he started pulling up all this stuff, and people would not believe him. No one would pay attention to him. And he got together with a woman named Dottie Davis, who was the county historian, and said, "Dottie, you got to come down here and check it out." She goes, "I'm not going down there." She had to learn how to dive. She went down there, saw the stuff, and called Tallahassee and said, "I think you guys need to get down here." So again, real quick, when the glaciers were big, the water was low, and so Florida was twice as wide as it is today. And so if you think about it, about half of the archaeological sites in Florida are underwater. And where they're going to be found is here in the Gulf. And speaking of that, this is Melissa Price, who was one of the lead scientists on the excavation and salvage operation at the Manatee Key offshore site. And this is right on top of the Manatee Key offshore site. And this is Manatee Key. Manatee Beach Club is right about over here. So this is about halfway between the public beach and Middle Beach. And it's in 20 feet of water. And they made me swim out to the boat. And I'm not a good swimmer, but I made it. And it's fascinating because, again, this is a formerly terrestrial freshwater marsh, was used as a cemetery for 1,000 years, and was recently discovered. So Melissa continues to do work there. 7,200 years ago, that was one of the radiocarbon dates they got. The water level is 33 feet lower than it is today. And what's now submerged looked like this. This is like a photograph out of the Carlton Reserve. You got these depression marshes. Well, they were all over the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico. It's just, that was Florida. It was just twice as wide. And the peat, or the organic material around the edge, is where these early people buried their loved ones. And they actually did it very carefully. They wrapped them in a woven blanket and stabbed them down with stakes into the muck. And this is how people were interred back in those days. And some of those stakes of wood stuck above the surface. And on some of the sites where a lot of research has been done on these, because there's one over on the East Coast where a lot of these type of burials were found, not one burial crossed over into another one. So it was almost like a modern cemetery where they knew where everybody was buried. And by the way, fibrous material, wood material, and other materials that you normally don't find have been found at the Manatee Key offshore site. So let's turn our attention to Spanish Point, my favorite place in the world. So this is kind of our map of Spanish Point. There are two primary features here. The archaic shell ring down in the lower right-hand side, which is again, in the summertime, a visiting place for people from all over to come and eat scallops at summer solstice. And then the ridge itself, extending out into the bay in a very unusual situation with a deep water channel running next to it, which could have even been excavated by Native Americans to put some of the material up here prior to the deposition of shell. And this would have started out just as a campsite, maybe on an oyster spit or a little sand spit, and they ate their meals and they stacked it up and they built their little homes. And we know that the homes were round because we know that from the archaeological work where they discovered post holes. We know that they had canoes that they could cruise around in. And if somebody wants to know more about that, ask me a question at the end and I'll tell you more about the canoes. This I like because it shows the barbecue. And one of the things that the Native Americans did was they smoked their meat to preserve it. because of course, again, they're used to hunting large animals and then having to make that last. And even though they moved to the coast and had all this opportunity to eat shellfish, they still ate, turtles, birds, deer, rabbits, virtually everything that was out there was free game. I'm sure they ate a lot of turtle eggs and bird eggs too, and stacked up the shell, continually stacking up the shell. And then it appears at some point where they actually got industrious about it and just started stacking up more shells to get it higher and higher. And by the way, most of this work was probably done by the women who lived here. And here we are picking berries. What's fascinating about Spanish Point when I took a tour with Bruce is when Bruce Holtz begins to tell me about plants that really only grow on the Indian mounds in Southwest Florida. That's their habitat. And yet that's kind of an artificial habitat created by these early people. So these early people created a new habitat, then supported plants that might have been beneficial to them, certainly beneficial to the pioneers that followed them. These were all artistic images that we had created for Spanish Point for our Window to the Past exhibit, where you can literally walk inside the Indian Mound and check it all out. So let's talk about some other archaeological discoveries. Well, the first archaeological discovery in Sarasota County was at Spanish Point by John Webb, the original homesteader who moved there in 1867, right after the close of the American Civil War. And he's digging in the garden and he starts finding skulls and bones and pottery and all kinds of stuff. And a friend of his knows Joseph Henry, the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institute. So he writes him a letter. He says, I discovered in ditching in my hammock a perfect skull. It was unfortunately broken in digging it out, but I shall send all the pieces and you will have no difficulty in gluing it into perfect shape. And so he begins to talk about it, and they sent scientists down to Spanish Point. And then this is another little description. I'm not going to read the whole thing. For about 1/3 of a mile along the southern shore of this promontory runs a well-preserved artificial shell mound. The mound commences near a point and reaches an elevation of 15 to 16 feet with a maximum breadth of about 125 feet. And that's where you are. Like if you were at Spooky Point tonight, you're on top of that. All right, here's what that all looked like. So there's the original homestead house here. Here's the addition that they had to build because so many people wanted to come to visit them, friends from New York, from Pennsylvania, from lots of states, including a lot of scientists from Smithsonian would come here. Here's the 3-hole outhouse, largest one in Sarasota at the time. It all looks pretty much like this. This photograph was taken from the top of the White Cottage, which is still there today. The point's still there. This is Casey Key, little mangrove islands, they're all still there. Some things never change. Smithsonian came down. Joseph Henry never came, but this guy, Spencer Fullerton Baird, he became the next director. He lived up in the tower there of the Smithsonian, the original building. And this is a little publication that they did, and they show Spanish Point, and they name the shoals out there called Trout Keys, and they show where all the different bones were buried. And this is based on work that took place in 1872, so that's pretty early. Now let's bump up to the north side of Sarasota, go up to a place called Yellow Bluffs, which is where the Sarasota Bay Club retirement center is today, just north of Van Wezel. So just for perspective, this little area right here would basically be where Van Wezel is today. And then this is called Yellow Bluffs. This was a yellow limestone outcropping with Indian Mound on top of it. Guy bought a lot of this property, ranging all the way up to approximately where the Ringling place is. He was from Frederick K. Williams. He's from Bristol, Connecticut. His goal was to sell land to his friends in Connecticut, get them to move down to Florida. He was an amateur archaeologist, so he knew that there were Indian mounds all over this whole area. And if you go up through Indian Beach, like Jungle Garden area and all that, there's little mounds all over up there. And many of them are actually still preserved because of the older homes are sitting on top of them. This was his promotional brochure from 1913, I believe, Indian Beach subdivision, fancy little green cardboard cover with a silver embossed Native American with the so inappropriate feather for Florida. And then bring it a little closer to home to where we are tonight, because we are right about here. We're right here. Let's see where my pointer is. Here is Palm Avenue coming down to Hudson Bayou. This is a 1899 plat of the Zachariewski subdivision. And here is Mound Street, so named for the mound here, which I think I have close-up view. Yeah. So here we are tonight. We're right here on lots 3 and 4. We span the boundary there. Payne Mansion is here. Selby House is down here. Here's the mound. It says 100 feet across, 20 feet tall. They named this Mound Street. So I think it's a hoot. Selby Gardens adopts Spanish Point and then changes its address from Palm Avenue to Mound Street. This is not the mound that was there, but this is exactly what it looked like. This was quite an attraction. Here's a real estate ad from May of 1913, for sale on Gulfstream Drive near Indian Mound. Yeah, want to live near the Indian Mound. And then this was kind of cool. A guy named Joseph Moss. He had come to Sarasota from Kansas in 1904. 1905, and he did a lot of construction work. And here, this article entitled "Indian Bones Discovered." They're doing some drainage near the 5 Points, and they find bones, they find beads, they find other stuff. This is June of 1910. Everything stopped. You know, everybody was checking it out. They probably put the stuff on display somewhere. 1910, downtown Sarasota, 5 Points, elevated land, great place to live. Here's what that looked like at that point in time, just for reference. If anybody knows where the Zenith building is that they're talking about tearing down now, that 10-story building, they're going to tear it down. So this is Lower Main. This is the Bayfront down here. This is 5 Points. And this is Sarasota's first bank building. Anyway, this is Main Street, unpaved at the time. This is looking up from Palm Avenue toward 5 Points. This is right where the bones were discovered, right here, what's called the Sarasota House. This was the boarding house here. These buildings all on the north side of Lower Main Street. The women of the community built the wooden sidewalks, by the way, and then the women also planted the oak trees to replace the trees that were lost when they cleared the road in the first place, which I think is funny. They cut down all the trees to create Main Street, and then they planted trees for the shade. And then this is a hotel, the Tarpon Club, that was built in the 1890s up on the Indian Beach area. This was just south. Like if you're driving Martin Luther King Boulevard down to the Bayfront, then you get to sweep around the Indian Beach area. This was just to the south of that, up on top of the Indian Mound. And a little article, which is, you know, not worth reading, but you can see the elevation. You can see how it's up on this hill here. And there's a huge ridge of Indian Mounds up there, like I said. Here's an article about Palms Villa on the Bay. This was a new name for the place, but they say the landscape up here, they say the landscape was left undisturbed. The Indian Mound and all the good stuff is still there, so you can go visit the Indian Mound up there. And then this is at a place called the Acacias. This was up where the Sarasota Bay Club Retirement Center is, Yellow Bluffs, originally owned by the Whitaker family, hence Whitaker Bayou, and they were the first family really to live in Sarasota beginning in the 1840s. Anyway, this is a burial mound, which Bertha Palmer's aunt, Laura Honore, built this little, what she called Lookout Mountain on the top. So down at Spanish Point, we've got the sunken garden and pergola with the Tuscan columns and the lattice work on top. Here we've got it on top of the burial mound up here on the Sarasota Bay. And I think that's, you can see these appear to be oleanders. Yeah, and cabbage palms and nice slash pines in the back. This mound unfortunately was destroyed in the 1960s to build a condo that was never built. There's a lot of that happens. This is a Immokalee. This is the home of Honore Palmer, Bertha Palmer's son. And this is at the Landings, where the Landings subdivision is today. And if you know anybody that lives in the Landings, that live in the tree houses, they're living on top of Indian Mound. And this particular house was a little north of the mound, and everything south of here had mound as well. And so and then this is at Spanish Point. This is actually Bertha Palmer's Gardens. This is just in front of the Gulto House. And you see, instead of, so I got to pause for a minute and say, in 1910, when Bertha Palmer bought the property at Spanish Point, almost everybody was selling their shell to the road builders, because that's what you build roads out of. So Sarasota's first automobiles, 1909, by 1910, there were a dozen of them. By 1911, everybody had a car. And so you needed hard roads, and so they would use the shell from the mounds. But instead, Bertha Palmer built her gardens on top. So for future reference, you go to Spanish Point, this tree's still there. These aloes are still there. Yuccas, whatever they are. Somebody will correct me. I'm not a botanist. I don't pretend to be one. And then here's an image of carting away shell mound. All right, so this is all this plentiful shell. And I'm sorry I'm favoring the audience on the right. I'm gonna start pointing over here. So check this out. This guy's just shoveling it into this little wagon here, and he's carting all that history away, literally carting history away. So we're very fortunate. In fact, I think I'm gonna write an article for like the American Public Gardens Association magazine called how gardens saved a historic site twice. Once by keeping it from becoming road, and once by keeping us from going broke 5 years ago. Anyway, this is a cool local photo. This is up by Whitaker Bayou. This is US 41, road cut through Indian Mound, Sarasota, Florida. And we're going to come back to this kind of topic a little bit later, because 10 years later, a guy comes to town and starts asking people, what all did you find in there? I'd really like to know. And then this is Bayshore Road, right where Indian Beach is. You're used to see it, and that's all Indian Mound. That whole, not only was there already Indian Mound there, but they paved this road with more Indian Mound out of that mound that we just saw. And again, this would be about where Van Wezel is, downtown Sarasota, and this is right about where you drive along the waterfront there, and you can see the water just north of Martin Luther King. This one. So this is an article from the Sarasota Times, and it's "Good Roads Mean Much." And I've blown up this one section. Basically, this guy wrote this article to basically complain that, well, this talks about the road will turn a little north of the bayou, following the trail cut about 5 years ago through the old Indian or pre-Indian mound. Skeletons found there by Whitaker, did the work, so the family, da-da-da-da-da. And then we're gonna move on here. This guy writes an article and he's saying, hey, apparently Hillsborough County had bought this huge Indian mound to pave roads with, and they hadn't done it yet. And they paid $8,750 for the shells, and they haven't mined it yet. And this guy is like really upset about it. Well, I'm upset that they mined it at all. And then now 1916, residential subdivision in Sarasota, McClellan Park. Unique because it was really the first subdivision by women in Sarasota. It was the first subdivision that had a landscape architect draw it up, and it was the first subdivision that actually was shaped around an Indian mound. And so unfortunately that mound is no longer there, but you can see from, I think I got a couple items here from McClellan Park promotion. Clubhouse is built back of an ancient Indian mound which formed the keynote to laying out the place and was the reason for giving Seminole names to the driveway. So when you drive around there, you will see some Native American names. And let's see if we got a little bit more interesting development property. This is more about McClellan Park. Throughout, the work has been planned around Indian Mound, which is located near the front of the property. Further carry the Indian interest, the cottages and streets have been given Indian names. So they were just promoting it. And here's McClellan Park. And here's about where the mound was. So a lot of people thought it was in the circle where the school was, but it was here. And these are all homes now. So here's the tennis courts. First, like, major tennis tournaments are Sarasota 1916. And another brochure, again, talking about the Indian Mound. So, all right, now we're going to move a little further south. Anybody ever heard of the Ides Center down by Sarasota Square Mall? Center for Chinese Literature. Well, Ellen Ides folks bought this property from the original developers, Barney. And Barney had the first attraction in Sarasota around here. Everybody on the right, look over here on the left. See this little thing right here? This is a fish, believed to be a fish weir, an ancient fish weir, where the Native Americans would catch the fish in the bay and put it in there for cold storage. There was another one just like this at the landings. It's all become a marsh now, the one at the landings. But at any rate, this was an alligator farm. And they were raising up the alligators to sell the hide, but also this was Sarasota's first tourist attraction. You go on down to the alligator farm, but you also wanted to see the Indian Mound. So we got an asphalt road now from Sarasota to Indianola Park, which is what they call it. So they named Indianola, and they talk about the mound. And yeah. And then out at Brookside, this is basically Bee Ridge Road and Swift Road. When they were developing that area, which by the way, Brookside had, everybody on the right, look on the left. It had a beautiful plaque. I mean, they showed this park, they kind of illustrated it like a landscape architecture thing, but they found the body of the Indian chief in the big mound there. And then every day there were articles in the paper about the big Indian mound there because they're trying to sell property during the 1920s. Here are some of them. All right, now, this is where my file got corrupted. So I'm going to do the best I can with the rest of these slides. So on the right-hand side is Philippi Creek in the 1920s when they were dredging it. A guy found a mastodon bone with a projectile point in it that the bone had grown around. So this is a mastodon bone, and no one in the 1920s ever dreamed people were in Florida for that long. And then this guy, J.E. Moore, went on to actually find skeletal remains that were fossilized, just like the mastodon, and they were lost in transit. All right. So, and then this is going down to Inglewood, and I don't know how well these slides are going to do because they're not going to do good at all. But I will tell you that so this is in the 1950s, John Fales, who was kind of an amateur archaeologist, and Dottie Davis did a study of mounds. And this is John on the left and Dottie on the right. Dottie Sue hired me into the county on November 22nd of 1979. This is a newspaper article from 1961. They drove all around the county and identified every site that they could find. And the one that they found that was getting ready to be bulldozed was at Indian Mountain Park in Inglewood on Lemon Bay, because they were going to dredge the intercoastal waterway and they were going to put all the spoil material from the dredging on top of the mound. And so Dottie got some archaeologists to go down there, and these are the kind of the profiles that archaeologists do. So they excavate downward in layers, because those layers represent the time clock, right? And then you'll see they got like shells, and they got black soil and shells and black soil. They identify the characteristics of the various layers. And then the further down they go, presumably the older it is, and the closer to the top, the younger it is. And then if you have materials that you can't radiocarbon date, but they're found in association with things that you can radiocarbon date, then you can certainly infer certain dates from that. And this was all going to be destroyed. Dottie got the road gang out there to do the labor. A guy named Ripley Bullen kind of oversaw part of it. He had also worked at Spanish Point, and they dug this thing up and found it was so significant there was no way they could destroy it. So they didn't. They kept it. It's now Indian Mountain Park. It's all written up in this brochure. This is where my slides got corrupted. Okay, so this is a cool slide because this is how creative these people were. So these are shark or sawfish vertebra punctured for beads. And actually in the burial mound at Spanish Point, there's an alligator buried on the top with a necklace with hundreds of these beads. These on the far left of both images are little points made from sliced deer bone, like deer leg bone. And these are about 3/8 of an inch wide, about 1/8 of an inch thick. These would have been your sewing needles. Here's an awl made from a piece of bone. Here's a piece of bone with holes punctured. Here are shark's teeth with holes punctured in them. Probably by another shark's tooth, right? What else is going to be hard enough to puncture that shark's tooth? All kinds of cool stuff came up out of that site. Here's some of the shell items: olive shell beads, scallop shell beads, little net weights made from fighting conchs. In fact, this is a very common find. And then goblets made from shells and other things made from shells and corrupted slides. So these are some of the folks that have done the archaeology around here. So Ripley and Adelaide Bullen, this is all messed up. This is Sonny Cockrell. This is not Dottie Davis. So I'm just going to go through. So on the upper left, Gordon Wiley, he did a lot of work down in Inglewood, worked for Smithsonian. John Goggins, kind of like the grandfather of Florida architecture. Marshall Newman worked for the Smithsonian. He did work down in Inglewood in the 1930s. This is George Lure. His father was who inspired Selby Gardens to be, specialized in epiphytes. This is Sonny Cockrell, who was the state underwater archaeologist when I met him in 1981. He's who did all the scientific work at Warm Mineral Springs. Dottie Davis, who hired me. John Fales is up here now. This is Adelaide Bullen. Ripley's out of the picture, but Adelaide actually studied the burial mound at Spanish Point more than her husband did, and so she gets a lot of credit too. Sorry about the corrupt images. And then some of the current people who are actively involved, for the most part, current. This is not George Lure. This is Steve Koski. All right. Miranda Kless. This is Miranda over here. All right. This is Bill Berger up here. And this is Joan and Marion. Boy, I really love how that AI got into my thing here. All right. You guys got any more energy? You want to do just a couple more slides? All right, let's roll. What is the relationship with the Seminole tribe? Well, the Seminole tribe says that when their people came down in here from Georgia, Alabama into Florida in the 1700s, they met up with some of the original Indians that were here, and they intermarried, and that they maintained the blood of the native people. Now, this isn't what they taught me in high school. They said, no, the Seminoles got nothing to do with it. But they came out with this article in the paper where they kind of tracked their lineage back through the Bear Clan and claim ancestry of these ancient peoples that were here in Florida. And if you ever have a chance in November to go down to their big arts and cultural festival, it is an eye-opening and a heartwarming experience to go do that, to get involved in the dancing and the crafts and the culture and all that stuff down at the Autatiki Museum. And Autatiki Museum is like, go out to Immokalee and you're out in the middle of nowhere and keep going and keep going and keep going, then take a right and keep going and keep going. And when you think you're lost, you get there. Yeah, I have no idea. Let's talk about this. So the deal they cut with the Seminoles, they said, you can have all this green. We just want the yellow and the red. So this was the original Seminole reservation that was done by treaty. This would take you from Disney World, basically down to Lake Okeechobee and all the way into Sarasota County. And that did not last very long. Anyway, these are images that are, sorry, corrupt. Some of the Native American garb, and mostly known as roadside attractions, right? You're going to Miami, you're gonna stop at the little roadside attraction down there. If you look at these people, when they were eating off the land, they're all very slender, barely getting enough to survive on. And then in the 1930s and 40s, the federal government started, took away all their land and started feeding them, basically sugar. And so now they've got one of the highest incidents of diabetes, obesity, and other issues. Of course, they do on Hard Rock. This is one of the villages that used to visit along the canoe trail. That was a big attraction. You go and buy the little dolls and stuff. And the little dolls look just like the people look. This is patchwork. This is taking any piece of clothing that you can get and cobbling it together. So I could do a whole program about Seminoles. These are little dolls. Anyway, y'all have been very patient. This is the attitude of the Seminole Tribal Preservation Office. No more stolen ancestors. They don't want to see any more native Florida people dug up. They don't see archaeology as a tool to, mess with their culture, but they do have archaeologists and they have an amazing museum and they have an amazing archive and they're doing work all over Indian country because they're one of the wealthiest tribes in America. So they're helping people all over. A lot of tribes don't have any money at all. And again, if you go down to Atafiki Museum, Atafiki means place to learn, a place to remember. It's a real great experience. And that kind of brings us back to Selby Gardens. And by the way, I will say, I have been involved in many capital improvement projects while I worked at the county. This is the only project I've ever seen where the artist rendering actually ended up looking like the final product. Or I should say the final product ended up looking like the artist rendering. So I think with that, I'll take a few questions at that time. What's the story behind the name Spanish Point? Yes. What an unfortunate name in a sense, but so the original homesteaders are coming down from New York. They're on a ship owned by the Faber Pencil Company, which is bound to Cedar Key to harvest pencil wood to make pencils. They stop at Key West and they encounter the Spanish fisherman who says, "You're looking for a place to live up there? You got to find this place. It's high and dry, build a nice house there." So what most people aren't aware of is from the middle 1600s up through the middle 1800s, Florida was where Cuba came for their fish. And this started with the Lent season, where they didn't have enough fish for Lent in the 1600s, and then it eventually went year round. And they took turtles off the beach, greens and loggerheads, and they caught thousands of pounds of fish. They had a fish camp in what's now Cherokee Park, owned by a guy named Philip Bermudez. Opie Creek is named for him. Guy up north here, just a little bit north of us, Al Zuarte, and we believe there was a fish camp at Spanish Point. So the Spanish fisherman tells the Webb family, go find the place. So they find the place, they write a letter back home, they say, we've arrived at the Spanish Point. They didn't call it that, they called it Little Sarasota. But the organization at one time made the decision to call it Historic Spanish Point, and people come saying, where's the gold, where's the galleons, where's the Spanish history? And there really isn't any, except for the fish camps, which have not been well interpreted yet at our property. So that's the name of Spanish Point. They wrote a letter back home, we've arrived at the Spanish Point. When they applied for a post office, John Webb applied for Little Sarasota. They said, sounds too much like neighboring town. Come up with another name, came up with Osprey for the fish hawk, which is great. That's like a native bird. Osprey Avenue in Sarasota is not named for the bird. What's it named for? It's the road to get to Spanish Point, literally. It's the road to get to White Cottage where the post office was at Spanish Point. So if you come down to the cafe, that was the post office. And Osprey Avenue is the road to get there. And that road was created in the 1870s. Any other questions? That question had like 3 answers. Yes, sir.
I went to an opening, Steve White had an opening, and there was a potter there, and she collects her clay, local sources. Says she collects a lot of clay in Ocala. I asked her about, clay deposits in this area. She said she couldn't really find any quality clay. You know of any clay deposits?
The Yellow Bluffs clay is good quality clay, and by that I mean that you can take that clay just as it is, not mix it with anything, form it, it'll harden solid as a rock. I used to make all kinds of stuff out of it when I was in high school. I still have everything I made. I never fired it. There's a site down off of Curry Creek where there are clay deposits, and there's an adjacent archaeological site that was believed to be a pottery manufacturing camp, where it's just tremendous volume of ceramic. So there are places along creek banks in various places and along the bay in certain places where you can harvest clay. And no doubt clay was a valuable commodity, and when they discovered an opportunity for that, I'm sure they went back to the same place time and time again to get it. Any other questions? All right, I'm just hopeful that I won the silent auction on the Liatris.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. I mean, what a wealth of knowledge and fascinating stuff. If you guys haven't guessed, our next field trip is going to be at Spanish Point. That's actually this Saturday. So we had quite a lot of people interested in that trip. Actually, our member David Turner is going to be leading that, and he's going to be doing an ethnobotany walk. So pointing out not only the mountains, but maybe what kind of plants the Native Americans would have used and what they would have used them for as well. I think. Yeah, go ahead.
And related, are there open spaces still?
It is sold out. We have a waiting list. It's one of those things you have to hop on early, but it's there's a lot of interest. Yeah.
And it starts at 10.
Right. So on Meetup it says 9 a.m., but we just learned that the Spanish Point doesn't open until 10 a.m. So if you are going, make sure to come at 10. We'll send a reminder out as well. And also it is part of the Selby family. So if you have a Selby membership, which we all do, right? It's it's free, but if you don't have a membership, it's $12 to get in. And then after that, so that's this Saturday, and then our next meeting is going to be here on November 17th, and we're going to have Sean Patton, another one of our members, and he's going to be speaking on aquatic butterfly gardening. A very specialized topic for our group, but really interesting stuff. So that's all I have for you guys, unless anybody else had any other announcements or anything they need to say. All right, awesome. So last thing is the silent auction. We have some great plants that were donated by Sweet Bay Nursery, as well as maybe some other stuff too. So I'll give that maybe 5 more minutes to bid on things, and then we'll leave the layout for John maybe. But otherwise, everybody have a great night. Thank you.
That's very interesting. I still got those crop slides in there.
Oh yeah.
It's just very strange. And what was the strangest thing about it was, I feel like 10 versions of this program. Every one that I went and retrieved off a flash drive exhibited the same crop